about those because they are always good for you to share what you're learning as you're continuing in your professional development as an administrator. So the topic today, it's elevating all communities, the role of adult education leaders in charting the path to equity. We are so grateful that we have Matthew Oberlander joining us today. He is working right now with LA Unified School District in the Division of Adult and Career Education. He is also a member of the Calpro Professional Advisory Board, and he, in his everyday role, is the coordinator for curriculum and instruction for his district. We are truly grateful for Matthew because he's done some work in this area of equity through post-secondary institutions and universities that really give him a background and a depth and understanding the importance of equity and access. And he's going to be sharing with us today some guidance and tips that can help us as administrators, aspiring administrators, and adult educators in general understand significantly more about the importance of our role in charting the path to equity. Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charisse, and thank you everybody for joining us today to discuss the role of adult education leaders in charting a path to equity. I just want to quickly start off by thanking Calpro for inviting me to present. I really care deeply about this topic, and it is a true honor to be able to be the one presenting today. I also want to thank Charisse for all her support in preparing for today's webinar. This presentation is based on work that Charisse has been doing throughout the state on equity. And it really wouldn't be possible without her. So I just wanted to thank her and also thank Vicki for all her support as well. So we're going to begin by me making a quick commitment to you as the webinar host. And I just wanted to commit to trying my best to create a safe learning environment. So during this webinar, we may be discussing topics of a somewhat sensitive nature, things like class and race and gender and sexual orientation. And so I'm going to do my best to be sensitive to the room and the space, and I'm going to invite you to review these commitments and work together with me to support this safe virtual space as we learn together. So let's quickly review these commitments. The first is just to listen to each other. There will be opportunities to participate, so I hope everybody can lean in and engage. Connected to that, please present your truths, be honest. Please be able to accept diverse opinions. Like I said, these are topics that could be sensitive to people, and they deserve a great deal of respect. So please be at your best in terms of respecting other people's opinions. Also, please try to commit to reflecting on your practice. You may feel some discomfort as we talk about some of these topics, and that's a good thing. So just be able to dwell in that space and grow through that. And then always, let's try to learn together. I'll be learning from you, you'll be learning from me, and we can support each other through this webinar. I'm also showing you these commitments because I'm trying to model for you a research-based best practice in terms of how to begin group discussions about things like equity and social justice. So when you bring this back to your agency, this is something you may want to begin with. So our learning objectives today are fairly simple. First, we want to try to define educational equity. Equity is a term that is sort of in vogue at the moment. It's used a lot. It kind of has a lot of meaning, so we'll try to work toward a shared understanding. We'll also try to make connections to the mission of adult education. I feel like really equity is at the heart of what we do, so we'll try to explore that a bit. I'll introduce the Calpro management competencies that were added this year that focus on equity, and then we'll talk about some strategies in terms of how to bring those competencies into your work and support equity and promote equity in your school and in your community. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a quick chat pod. So as you can see, a chat pod magically appeared at the bottom of the presentation and it says, how do you define equity in education? So I'm going to ask you to take a couple minutes to please reflect on what equity in education means to you, and then please provide a quick, short definition in the chat pod below. And I'm going to All right, I'm back now. Um, I'm just going to call out a few things that I'm seeing emerge from the responses. Sort of some of the words that seem to be coming up a lot are things like all, and it has been capitalized a couple times for emphasis. That's a huge part of equity, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But really, it is about um, reaching toward equity and access and opportunity for everybody, for all. So that's great. I see the word access a lot, like I mentioned. Student is brought up a lot. The word equal comes up a lot, so we'll talk a little bit about equity and equality and how those relate to each other in a minute. A shout out for the person who mentioned universal design, which is a very interesting component of equity, and as a curriculum and instruction person, by law I have to call it out when someone mentions it. Opportunity comes up a lot, access. So it really sounds like, or it looks like there's a good understanding generally of what equity is all about. The words access and opportunity are very important. The words all students, the needs of students, which comes up a lot, is also very important. So let's move on and let's kind of move toward a shared understanding of what equity is. Thank you very much for contributing. So we'll begin with just a very simple definition, and this is from good old dictionary. It says justice, equity is justice according to natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias or favoritism. So this is a very simple, broad definition of equity. The reason I think it's important to look at it is because it has a couple words in it that we want to call out. One is the word justice, and one is the word right. These are important concepts. These are really powerful ideas, and it's important to see that equity in education is rooted in the ideas of justice, and we'll extend that to the idea of social justice, and then to the idea of rights or human rights or civil rights. So let's move a little bit deeper into the definition. I think this is a a chart that provides a good explanation, a good simple explanation of what equity in education is all about. It kind of compares the concepts of equity and equality. Both strategies are, both are strategies that are used to promote fairness, but they're very different in how they go about doing it. So for example, we'll look at equity. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful. So it talks about needs, which someone mentioned or a few people mentioned before, and it may appear unfair, but it actively moves everyone closer to success by leveling the playing field. So that's an important point as you move into doing equity work or as you apply an equity lens, that for some people it may be jarring because it may appear unfair. And then in contrast we have equality, which is treating everyone the same, which also aims to promote fairness, but it really only works if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same help or has the same needs. So these are, I think, important comparisons to make as you move toward integrating equity into your day-to-day work as a leader. One thing that is important also to note is, in terms of equity, if you're giving everyone what they need to be successful, that means you really need to understand individual needs of your student. So that's something to reflect on, how you might do that, what processes are in place to really develop those relationships where you identify the needs of students. And then secondly, in terms of equity appearing unfair, that's something to really be conscious of as you begin to do this work. How do you frame equity-based decisions so that people really understand them? And so just one quick story to kind of provide a connection to this idea of equity versus equality. So when I was preparing this presentation, my daughter came and asked me to look at it. She likes to kind of look at the work I do. And I showed it to her and we talked about equity and equality. And she's 11 years old. She's a bright and precocious young woman. And then later that night, she was upset. And I went to talk to her and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, I'm upset because you spend too much time with my brothers." I have 2 sons and a daughter. And one of my sons is 1 year old. He's a baby, so he needs a lot of time. The other son is a little bit older, but he happened to be sick that day, and so we were spending a lot of time with them and not with her. And so I was able to kind of reflect with my daughter back on this idea of equity and equality and show her how in her life, it may appear unfair that we're spending time with her brothers, but in fact, they at the moment have the need for that support. And she's more independent, and at the moment she didn't. But now, because she's coming to me and she's expressing that she's upset, I'm understanding that she has, needs as well that need to be addressed. So that's sort of the idea of providing each person what they need at the moment based on their specific needs. Another thing to note is that equity and equality differ in how they're sort of centered. So equity is a human-centered approach. It really begins with people and it benefits the individuals. Equality is more of a systems-centered approach. It's a kind of changes you can make to a system. You do something all the same way, but it really kind of benefits the system as a whole. It just makes it more efficient, typically. So because equity is a human-centered process, it also requires sort of a relationship-based engine. So that's why education and the counseling component of education are places where equity is really critical and places where equity work can be done in a really powerful way. So this is an image that kind of sums up the general definition for equity in a really strong way. It's from the Interaction Institute for Social Change. As you can see, each person, when they get sort of the same level of support, their access is very different. And for in terms of equity, when people get the support that they need, everybody has access. So the Interaction Institute for Social Change also kind of challenged people to extend this image and remix this image. So the next image is one that I kind of liked, which is, the difference between equality, equity, and sort of the reality that we sometimes perceive. I think this is a very powerful message and helps us to understand, why equity is so important. So now let's move into making some connections to adult education. I'm going to ask you to again provide me with a couple responses, or one response. I'm going to ask you to complete the statement below. So I work in adult education because I believe. So we'll start to make some connections to what we do as adult educators. I'm going to mute my microphone and I'll be back in a couple minutes. All right, I'm back. Thank you so much for responding. I'm seeing a lot of just really powerful messages on the importance of what we do. The idea of opportunity is coming up a lot. That seems to be central to a lot of people's beliefs and why they work in adult education. Justice, access, improving lives. A lot of talk about students transforming sort of their lives and their paths through education. So I think it's really, really powerful to see multiple perspectives on what we do and sort of a list of core values that we have as people and leaders. And it really speaks to the tremendous transformational power of adult education. So I want to move into equity and its connection specifically to adult education. So as we move into a discussion of data, I just wanted to call out that when we do the work of equity, data really is a critical element, and viewing data through an equity lens can really help understand our role as adult education leaders and advocates for the communities we serve. So this very quickly is a chart of the federal guidelines for poverty for 2017. Take a look at it, reflect a bit on those numbers with me. Take a second to think about where you fall, and I'm going to probably imagine that there are a lot of us who, according to this chart, would probably be able to support fairly large families. But I also want you to think about it in terms of, for example, there are 5 people in my family, and I make a decent wage, and it's still not always easy. And so really keep in mind sort of, the struggles that are a reality to the students we engage with and serve every day, and just how much they deserve excellence and how much they deserve to be given the support they need to transform their lives. There are, as of 2016, just a few quick statistics, 40.6 million people living in poverty in the United States. 6% of the population, or 18.5 million people, live in deep poverty with incomes at only 50% of the poverty threshold. So 50% of what we're seeing here. And for adults 25 and older with no high school diploma, the poverty rate is 24.8%, or 5.6 million. So the work we do in terms of being adult educators directly connects to helping people who are at or below the poverty level, helping people who need assistance to support themselves and their families. So in a way, we really, all the work that we do is equity work in a sense. And I think that's important to internalize and important to own as an equity leader in adult education, and to bring that perspective to partners and to use it to advocate. Another thing that's important, though, when we do work in education is to kind of move toward disaggregating data and thinking at the level of the subgroup or the individual. So here, as you can see, not only in the federal sense is poverty a huge issue in our country, but in California there are also 8 million people who live in poverty. And as you also may know, many of us serve these individuals on a regular basis. We serve these people and their families. So let's move from these general statements toward a couple slides on the idea of data that is disaggregated. So one sort of model, one thing that I'm trying to model as an equity practice here is that data often comes to you in large generic chunks, but equity is built around, as we noted, the needs of individuals and the needs of, for example, groups that have historically been underserved or marginalized. And so just take a look at this and see how that data that we looked at that's so powerful at the federal and state level, there are elements behind it that we want to look at as well, and we want to bring this to our conversations and bring this to the work that we do. Here's another one I'd like you to take a look at. And this has to do sort of directly with our role in addressing the poverty crisis in the country and in California. So just take a minute to reflect on how adult education might impact this specifically. So as we get back to our purpose, I just wanted to call out, I mean, even on a moral level, we definitely need to engage with people who have low skills or people who are living in poverty. It is the right thing to do, and I think all of us believe that, and that's why we do the work that we do. It also is, it's what we're called to do by the federal government and by the state. We're public servants, we're publicly funded, and really our role is to provide opportunities to transform people's lives, build skills, and move people out of situations of poverty or economic disadvantage and into sort of self-sustaining wages and into careers that lead to better lives for them and for individuals and their families. So this is just a connection to WIOA, which is very much about that specific calling. So as you can see, a lot of the work that we do is equity work. One of the things that I hope you'll take away from this presentation is just generally a feeling that you are a leader in equity already, and that it's important for you, as it says on the slide, to be attentive to the issues of race, class, gender, poverty, language proficiency, power, and privilege, because those are really the core elements of what we do in adult education. It's also important for us to have as a mindset the idea, which a lot of you have already expressed, that it's about access for everyone. It's about access for all. And if you can kind of internalize that purpose and that mission and begin to develop a lens and set of strategies, it can be very powerful and help you in your work. I see there's a question. It says, from the previous slide, do 8.5% of college live in poverty, or do 8.5% of those in poverty have a college degree? Yes, 8.5% of those who live in poverty have a college degree versus the larger number for those without. But yeah, I just really want to kind of give you a moment to think about how you are already a leader in equity, how you are already working with a lot of the populations who historically have been underserved, and take a moment to think, and we'll move into some specific strategies, but take a moment to think about what that means when you walk into a room of, for example, employers or partners, or if you're working with community colleges or working with community-based organizations, walking in and saying, we work in adult education is wonderful, but also being able to say, we work in adult education and we are leaders in our community in doing equity work can be very powerful. Or talking to an employer and bringing that sort of lens or that advocacy position and saying, we can help not only provide you with wonderful employees who are skilled, who are trained, but we can help your company or your organization be a part of the equity work that's happening in the community and that's happening in a lot of other institutions. All right, so as we move on to sort of the specifics of how this can be done, I'm going to invite you to quickly look at these descriptors for students and go ahead and just click on the ones that you think apply to your school or your institution. And let's see how many of us are serving this diverse group of students. And I see there's a question from Allison about the previous slides. Those are statistics based on adults over 18, correct? One thing that I should note, though, however, is the slide where it's disaggregated by race is actually done by family unit. So it's adults over 18, but it aggregates the income of all adults in a household. Thank you for the question, Allison. All right, so as you can see, we are absolutely doing equity work every day. The vast majority of us, as this poll shows, are serving students who maybe historically have been underserved, who maybe historically have been marginalized. This is a really powerful opportunity for us to embrace that role as equity leaders, and for us to begin making decisions through that lens and bringing that perspective to our advocacy work. And I'm going to move on to the next slide and to the next section, and we'll talk about some specific strategies for promoting and improving equity in your school and in your community. Yeah, great point from Chris Nelson about how potential funders and politicians should also know that we are, change agents in bringing about equity. So as I mentioned many times, it's a position of advocacy that I think we really should embrace as adult education leaders. Now I want to introduce the Calpro management competencies that were added this year that connect specifically to equity. You may know that Calpro has something called the Management Competencies Self-Assessment, which is a list of competencies that are research-based, that adult leaders should have, or that show effective practice as an adult leader. This year they asked a group of people to come together and kind of work on some equity-focused competencies to add to it. Carol Hirota, who's on this webinar, was part of the process. I also was part of the process. There's a quick question. In what classifications are LBGT students? So we'll touch on that a bit later, because that's sort of in the third of the competencies here. But if anyone wants to respond to that now, you can. Oh, and Sharice is providing in the chat pod access to the management competencies. So we'll move forward, and I'll respond to your question, Martha, when we get to that slide. So take a second, if you haven't already, to quickly read through the competencies that have been added. And I'm going to move on, and we'll talk about them individually. So the first one is to promote an environment that values and appreciates linguistic and cultural differences. So as our survey showed, we definitely have diversity amongst all of our agencies, or within all of our agencies. So I also wanted to point out with each of these competencies some opportunities they provide, and then some strategies that you might use to bring this this competency into the work that you do and to maximize its effect at your agency. So the first set of opportunities are, one is to make a public commitment to equity. And one way to do that is to maybe develop a shared equity vision statement or a shared equity mission statement. A lot of agencies, have a vision statement or have a mission statement. You could think about maybe creating a separate one around equity, or you could think about coming together and maybe looking at your vision and mission statement through that lens and trying to see if it can be updated or if it can be enhanced in some way. Another opportunity is to promote this idea by celebrating diversity and celebrating equity. And you can do that by establishing traditions that honor diversity and celebrating success related to equity. It's the traditions we have at our schools are very powerful, and they send a message in terms of our core values and what we think is important. And so if you can for example, celebrate not only teachers who are amazing teachers and are able to help students, a large percentage of their students complete a class, maybe start to break down some of the completer data or break down some of the achievement data by subgroup and start to celebrate accomplishments and achievements related to equity and related to groups that maybe historically have needed more support. Sachi is asking about if Calpro offers any professional development on equity for instructors and staff, so I'll let Charisse kind of answer that one. So for each of these competencies, I'm going to talk about opportunities and strategies, and then I'm going to also give you links that you can explore later. You'll have a PDF of the slide, links that provide resources for how to do some of these activities or implement some of these strategies. So for this one, for creating an equity vision, I've got a link for a guide to how to do that, and then I've got some research about the power of school traditions as well. Another of the competencies is to promote organization-wide culturally responsive policies and practices. And so a couple opportunities here that we identified. One is to integrate equity into policy development, and there are a couple ways to do that. One, which is not so obvious, is to kind of think about the group that is at the table when policy is developed, and to see if that is a diverse group, to see if it represents your communities and the demographics of your school populations. Another way to do that is the one that we've been talking about a lot, which is to sort of bring that equity lens to the advocacy work you do in terms of developing policy with partners or as a consortium or with employers and stuff like that. So those are a couple strategies for that. The other opportunity is to kind of create space for equity dialogue and learning amongst your staff and faculty. Like I said, this is sort of sensitive topic sometimes, so when you do that, you want to be careful in how you frame things and make sure that you provide some kind of norms at the beginning or commitments or agreements so that everybody can engage in a thoughtful and meaningful way. So you can do that by having regular equity-related conversations with your staff. You can also do it by providing equity-related PD at your school site. So I have a couple links here that could be helpful to you as a leader. One is a link to the Literacy Information and Communication System links, which you may all know of, which is sort of a place where people can come together and communicate around sort of adult education topics. They have a specific group on minority serving community colleges and affiliates, and if you go there, you can find a lot of great information, great discussions on how to serve students from diverse backgrounds, and how as a post-secondary institution in particular you can work to sort of address those equity issues in an effective way. And you can also go there and ask a question and get great feedback from the people who are part of that COP. The other resource I have for you in terms of dialogue and learning is a link to some videos about courageous conversations about race in schools. These are really helpful, like I said, because some of these issues can be, can bring to surface feelings that can be difficult to engage with or can be uncomfortable for people. So having a resource that's sort of a third point that you can, as a group, use to learn can be very helpful. And just as a side note, our district, LAUSD, requires every K-12 teacher to go through a training on linguistically and culturally responsive pedagogy, but they haven't extended that to adult education, which is something that I think is kind of ironic, since really adult educators are working with the same populations and the parents of the students, and in some cases with populations that are not often represented in secondary institutions or in K-12 institutions. So something to think about in terms of the training you provide your teachers and how well equipped they are to serve their students. So the third competency that we want to look at is it is to establish systemic supports for historically underserved students, non-traditional students, students with disabilities, English learners, and LGBTQ community members to achieve access and success. And so as Martha had asked earlier, this is where sort of the LGBTQ community comes into play in terms of the historic path that they have been on and the historic level of service they've received and the sort of discrimination that they've received and the lack of services that they've been provided. So this is the place where we would kind of fold them into this equity work, or fold that group into this equity work. So in terms of establishing systemic supports for the groups that maybe haven't traditionally had those supports, one opportunity is to analyze equity-related data and to allocate resources differently or with an equity-informed decision-making process. A couple strategies for doing that: you can sort of disaggregate WIOA data and begin to analyze sort of the demographic and barrier-related information there. You can develop an equity-based funding formula if that's something, if you want to be very ambitious. That is something that has happened, for example, like in the community colleges. There's now an equity-based component to their funding formula. So just ways of thinking about resources, ways of looking at achievement that call out these historically underserved groups and populations and aim to address those disparities or those gaps where they exist. And aim to kind of create supports that are personalized to those communities and then to the individuals in those communities as well. The second opportunity is to connect with equity-related initiatives that already exist. So for example, integrated education and training is really about those English learner populations, and the immigrant integration programs that the state has been developing are also about serving, English learners, immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. So for this competency, I've provided a couple resources. The first is just a really interesting study about workforce development in low-income adults and youth. So you can look at that when you have time, but it's just a very powerful presentation of all the different sort of diverse populations that are part of the workforce development system and how to serve them. There's a good question from Martha about disaggregating WIOA data to identify LGBTQ students. As far as I know, it's not something that's collected at the moment, but there is movement toward sort of integrating some of the those factors into the way or those elements into the way we collect data from students. For example, there is a move in terms of choosing a gender, to move from just having a binary option to having a third option, where it's sort of the gender is undefined or not defined. So I think that Martha's pointing out that that's something that, as we do the equity work, sort of the the support system within which we work, or the framework within which we work, is also adapting and changing. So yeah, take a minute to look at that when you have time after the presentation. I also put in a couple resources related to IET and the immigrant integration initiatives. Both of those are things that you could very well be doing at your school sites at the moment. But these two resources give a good sort of introduction to how they can be done if you aren't already. And this really is, these are equity-focused initiatives and really worthwhile work to do. So another competency is to uphold and communicate an organizational belief that all students are capable of success and that their individual identity and agency is affirmed and valued. So the opportunity that we identified here is to build equity into comprehensive counseling services. In other words, really think about the support systems, inside and outside of class, and think about how you are providing personalized connections to students and personalized support to students. Some strategies are to provide personal career coaching and educational planning for all your students. And one strategy that we're trying to develop and use here in our district is to implement like an individualized learning plan or student plan for all of your students. We've always had one here for our academic students, our secondary students, but we're now trying to develop these for ESL students, for basic skills students, for CTE students. So really by shifting your resources so that you're providing much more support, you're providing comprehensive support, you have coaches, you have navigators, that's one way to really communicate your belief that all students are capable of success and that you really want to meet every student where they are and take them to where they want to be. And so as a resource in terms of this work, I've provided links to a couple initiatives that are connected directly to student planning, to career pathways, to the Guided Pathways initiative in the community colleges. A lot of research has been done to support the idea that motivation is really critical for adults, and counseling is really critical for motivating students. Yes, it can be done and should be done to some degree in the classroom, but there should also really be a robust system that exists outside of the classroom to help identify the needs of students, to help build relationships with students so they feel comfortable expressing what they need and what support would help them, and then to address those needs in a way that is meaningful and in a way that really impacts the achievement of students. So the next competency I wanted to discuss is I believe the final one, which is to analyze structural aspects of curriculum and identify barriers to learning and opportunities to incorporate diverse perspectives and experiences. So this kind of brings it down. We started at the yes, we're equity leaders. Yes, we're going to advocate from that position, to sort of, okay, in doing that, what can we do specifically at our site to improve how equity is done, to improve the supports we're providing to students, to promote the idea of equity amongst staff and amongst the community members and partners. And so now we're moving toward from the counseling world or the counseling office into the classroom. And here there are some really critical opportunities in terms of how learning happens and how teaching happens and how we support all students in access to high standards, high quality learning, and real meaningful student achievement. So one of the opportunities is to integrate equity into curriculum. One way to do that is to diversify the curriculum development team. Think about who at your school is on that team. Is it representative of your student population? Are there voices that should be there that aren't there? Another thing is to maybe adopt an equity-aligned curriculum framework. So there are a lot of different ideas for doing that. I had mentioned earlier that idea of the culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, which comes from a specific curriculum and teaching framework. Another opportunity is to support equity-based curriculum interpretation. So as teachers come together in PLCs or come together in faculty meetings to interpret the curriculum and to make meaning of what they have been asked to do, course outlines, textbooks, and things like that, providing sort of a space for them to think about curriculum through an equity lens and to have those discussions as they develop and enhance and supplement the work that they're doing with students. So I have a quick question from Carol Hirota. In the future, WIO data will include gender non-binary as a choice. Yes, exactly. So that's the third option that they're working toward. So again, here in terms of the curriculum development and framework that I had mentioned, I've provided a link to that culturally responsive teaching framework. It's from Brown University. If you have a chance to go there, they'll give you, a lot of research behind how students who have, for example, come from underserved populations, how much more they respond to curriculum that embeds voices that are close to those that they, understand or live in, or close to those that they hear every day, or close or represent the experiences that they have in their communities and in their lives. The other thing that I've presented here as a resource is the kind of a link to some strategies that I mentioned on the first slide about how to support curriculum interpretation by encouraging teams to talk about issues of diversity and modeling equity beliefs and clarifying misconceptions about equity, and just generally creating a safe, affirming learning environment for teachers to have those discussions. All right, so we've talked about big picture, what is equity? We defined it. We've talked about some of the data. We've talked about our role as equity leaders and our opportunity as equity advocates. We've talked about the management competencies, and I've given you sort of a lot of opportunities. I've provided you with a bunch of strategies, and there are resources that you can look at after the webinar to continue the learning and extend some of the ideas. But I want to ask you now, since we're kind of closing up the webinar, to just take a minute. We're going to have another chat pod that will magically appear, and if you could just take a second to write down maybe one action you might take to support educational equity or to build educational equity in your agency. So just a quick sentence. All right, we're running out of time. We're almost to the end of our hour, so I'm just going to thank you for the thoughtful responses. I'm really happy to see that people are putting in, what seemed to me to be very clear next steps and very doable next steps. So I'm glad that this was, I think, helpful and maybe providing you with some different examples of things that can be done that are feasible, that are interesting, and that are exciting. Things like PD, things like integrating equity into your faculty meetings, into your WASC planning process, into your mission statement, into your vision statement, etc. I'm going to move to the next slide. I'm going to leave you with this, which is a quote from Howard Thurman, who is an author and philosopher and theologian. He also happened to be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s spiritual advisor, which is, the ultimate mic drop, I think. So he says, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And so I hope that, although equity is wonderful, it provides a common language and a coherent framework for understanding and communicating the purpose and value of adult education. It provides us with a lens through which we can see the world, but I also think it's important and critical to understand that it provides us, with a lens through which we can see ourselves. And the thing about it that I think is greatest is that it provides us with a way as leaders to have maybe a renewed sense of joy and inspiration, or that's my hope. That's what it does for me. It gives me joy because I can recognize the promise that equity holds. I recognize the fact that the students, our students that have the greatest need, really are the students that provide the opportunity to make the greatest impact. So I hope you walk away feeling, inspired and feeling happy and feeling ready to take on the challenge. And really, I hope that you understand that you are already an equity leader by working in adult education. And I encourage you to go forth and to make an impact in your communities. And
Thank
so,
you so much, Matthew. This has been a wonderful, wonderful webinar filled with great information. Um, if there are questions that you might have, you can continue typing those into the chat pod. We'll keep that open for a few more minutes, but I can't thank you enough, Matthew. This was a very powerful and thoughtful webinar, and it does leave me thinking about the promise that equity holds, as I'm sure everyone else feels the same. I know several of you have asked about the webinar in general, the PowerPoints that was shared. You'll notice in this chat pod on the bottom right, labeled resources, there are two documents in PDF. One of those is the actual PDF of the webinar slides, and the other is an amazing handout that really summarizes what Matthew shared today in terms of the areas in which you can look at and support equity. So I will give you a moment to upload those and save those documents before we close out here. You'll also see on the bottom left the webinar survey. If you like this topic and topics like this, we need to hear from you to find out what else you would like us to share with administrators that you feel is of critical importance to help you in your practice. Equity, we know, is one of those. Please complete the web surveyor and let us know other ideas that you would like us to share with you. Thank you again, and hopefully you've been able to get those two resources there. This webinar is recorded and will be available in the Calpro video library within about a week's time. We will have our next Administrators Forum webinar in the spring of 2019, February or March or so. Look for information about that webinar coming, and it will be on removing barriers to student success. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.